27th of February, Corporate Scrutiny Committee meeting to discuss the single agenda item or single substantive agenda item of the floating bridge. Item number 1, apologies and changes in membership. I've received an apology from Simon Cook, but otherwise I think the committee are all here and present. Item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any? Councillor PC Wilcox.
I suppose I should declare an interest in as much as I do use the floating bridge, as do probably members of my family.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether that's really declarable, but if it is, I'm sure most of us have used it at some point. Item number 3, public question time. I've been handed 3 notes here, and I can see 3 members of the public in the gallery. So number 1, I've got Sharon Lake.
Hello. During most of its working life, Floating Bridge 5 was on schedule where it did return 6 crossings an hour. You never had to wait more than 10 minutes for the floating bridge. This presentation and computer modelling prove that Floating Bridge 6 is not able to do the 6 return crossings promised in the business case. Will the council start being open and transparent about the frequency and reliability of Floating Bridge 6 and produce accurate data?
Thank you. Obviously, we didn't have that in advance, so can't guarantee a response to that. But I don't know whether there's anyone in the cabinet who wants to make, or indeed an officer who wants to make comments on data. Colin Rowland.
I think some of that data will come clear from the presentation from our esteemed gentleman here from 3S. It's part of that conversation in terms of the presentation.
Did you hear that response?
Yes.
And did you want to come back? There's an opportunity for a supplementary or further question.
Yes, I have. As Floating Bridge 6 is not frequent, as this report's proven, and given the fact it cannot meet the requirements set out in the business case, will the engineers be able to ensure that the next floating bridge meets these frequency requirements, and how would they do that?
Again, that sounds like it's something that will come out in this report, in this discussion today. Yeah. So hopefully you will learn at least part of that answer in this conversation, in this meeting today. Okay. And of course, it's coming back to next corporate scrutiny as well. But thank you very much. Question number 2, Councillor Tracy Reardon. Thank you.
Good evening. Residents of East Cowes have put up with an appallingly infrequent and unreliable service for 7 years now, and this presentation finally shows a real way forward, which we all knew was a new floating bridge. So when will the Cabinet, full Council and Scrutiny vote to make the decision to design and procure a new floating bridge to serve the people of East Cowes?
Mr. Rowland, can you just make a comment on timeline?
I think, again, that will come out of the conversation that we have and part of the Cabinet report that we'll be writing as well.
Yeah, so a Cabinet report should come out from this, and I understand may well be put before Cabinet in March, and then decision would flow from that. What the decision will be, obviously, don't know at this stage. Thank you. Was there a further comment or question?
Oh, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, former member of this committee, Councillor Cameron Palin.
Thank you, Chair. East Cowes Town Council were told by the Cabinet Member for Transport that we would get advance sight of the full report ahead of its publication. So we're wondering when this would be, as I note this evening's presentation, and will we also receive the full presentation, as only the first 17 pages of the document are actually available online. And I know that the full document has been circulated to members. However, I would like to say what's been seen of the report is actually is to be applauded, because it's actually gone into detail and had engineers involved in that process. But we will be able to see a full copy of the presentation that you have got this evening.
Yeah, thank you. So members of this committee were circulated at the end of last week a draft report with appendices that ran to 124 pages, but I think that the report itself is something like 18 pages. I've been told that for this meeting, we can refer to that report, so possibly the confidentiality now falls away. It's still got a draft watermark on it. Can I just ask Mr. Rowland, in what way or manner will the report be put into the public domain in full, or indeed Mr. Springate?
Oh, right. It's been left in draft until we feel everybody has had an opportunity to offer those comments they want to offer. Then we'll relook at the draft, make any amendments or extensions that we feel are necessary, then issue it as a final document.
I think the point, and I'll ask him to come back in a minute, that Councillor Palin is making is that East Cowes Town Council would quite like to see an advanced copy. I mean, can this copy we've now got in front of us go into the public domain at all? Yeah, it sounds, Cameron, that we've got some nods. So this copy that we've got in front of us can go out into the public domain following this meeting.
Yeah, that's perfect. And even if it can't go to the public domain, if it could be shared to us in confidentiality or something, just so we can look over it ourselves and give comments, you know, from the residents of East Cowes, and I'm sure Cowes Town Council would like to see it too.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That deals with the public questions. Progress update, pages 5 and 6. So we've got the forward plan and the committee's work programme. I've got a couple of updating comments on the work programme. Just before I invite any thoughts on whether there's anything on the forward plan, which I don't think there is, on our work plan. So looking to the March corporate scrutiny, the Community Safety Partnership Annual Report won't be available. So I've agreed to push that back to the May meeting. So that comes out. An update to the papers you've got in front of you is that the floating bridge will come back in March with a cabinet report attached to it. I should just say the reason we're having this meeting now is that the consultants are not available for the next corporate scrutiny committee. So this is our opportunity to speak and question the consultants in person. That's why we're having this additional meeting. Just looking at May, we expect to have future governance as an item in May as well as March. And the policy framework annual review will probably push back to June because May meeting is now looking quite full with the other items on it. Is there any other comment anyone's got to make on the forward plan or our work plan? Councillor Spink.
Yeah, I would just like to make a comment that I'd like for our next meeting, please, in March, for confidentiality to be put on the agenda. It's something of a bugbear of mine. I've been speaking about this at every single meeting for the last 3 meetings of corporate scrutiny. And today is a perfect example of how confidentiality is claimed. So the public don't see it, other councillors don't see it. Councillor Jarman, who would like to ask some questions, hasn't been permitted to see it. And then at the door of the chamber, it's no longer confidential. We need, and I want it on the agenda with a cabinet report, please, on how we are going to deal with confidentiality in this council. And I see Councillor Jordan pulling a strange face. What I would like is, please, a report which ought, in my view, to say the following, that the correct way to deal with confidentiality is for an officer, preferably the monitoring officer or a legal officer, to set out by highlighting a report what are the confidential elements, and then can delete it if he thinks it's redacted if appropriate, together with a short report explaining why it's confidential and why the public interest in open and transparent government, which is a rule of law, is being outweighed by the confidentiality. And I don't want, with great respect, because I've raised this so many times now and it's still not sorted out. I don't want to come here next time and find, for example, with Yarmouth School, which we'll be considering next time, there's absolutely nothing in the papers. Thank you.
So thank you, Councillor Spink. I think the fact that Yarmouth Primary School is on the agenda for next month gives us a live, genuine agenda item in which to test the concepts of confidentiality. And you and I are in a position as chair and deputy chair of this committee to scrutinise the officer's opinion on what can or can't be shared prior to that meeting and prior to the papers going out. So I agree with a lot of what you say about confidentiality, but we have a live, genuine item on that agenda in which to test those principles. And you and I happen to be in a privileged position to be able to do that as chair and vice chair.
Well, Chair, I don't know if that will be the case. In the past, for example, corporate scrutiny has been served with papers, for example, Kingston Marine, and corporate scrutiny could see none of it. We didn't know who it was going to. We didn't know how much. All we know was that there was someone interested. And I don't see why it can't be. I'm going to press this. A proper agenda item with a proper means of identifying confidential documents policy for this council. I don't want to be in another corporate scrutiny committee arguing this point. I'm fed up with it and I've argued it consistently now for weeks. I'd like it, please, as vice chair on the agenda.
So I agree with you over Kingston Marine, and I've talked about that a lot. It was a different chair on this committee at the time. I have no idea what conversations went on, and I'm certainly not looking to apportion blame to anyone else because I simply don't know. But you and I have an opportunity to explore all this with the officers for the next meeting on an agenda item. Now, if you or I are not happy with that, at that meeting, we can voice those concerns, and then perhaps we can agree to have a freestanding agenda item in May to explore the things we're not happy with and the wider principles that you want. So what I'm suggesting is we do that in May rather than March if the Yarmouth Primary School proves not to be a very satisfactory test case.
Well, I'm sorry, Chair. I'm going to have to disagree. And if you don't agree to what I'm suggesting, it should come in March. We cannot limp on until May, assuming that things are confidential without any proper legal tests being applied. And I would ask you, please, to put it on the agenda as a formal item. If you resist this, then I'd like the minutes clearly noted, please, Melanie.
I'm not sure it's particularly in my gift. I think probably the best option is to open it up to the committee. And I'm willing to devote a few minutes to discussing it. But I think you've heard what I've said. You've heard what Councillor Spink has said. I've suggested we deal with a confidential issue, which is Yarmouth Primary School. And if Councillor Spink and I and others on the committee aren't happy at the next meeting with the way that's done, that activates a freestanding agenda item on the issue of confidentiality. Councillor Spink is saying, why wait till May? Do it now. I want to avoid a conversation unless anyone has anything particularly important to add. I'm simply going to ask for a vote, March or after March. Councillor Quirk.
We don't need confidentiality sorted out for one meeting. We need it sorted out in the long term as to what the principles are, because there seem to have been the motivation for confidentiality is if there is an agreement with someone else, then it's confidential, and that isn't necessarily the case. So I think in the long term, we do need to sort it. I wonder whether it might be better to actually look at the case and see whether it can work at the next meeting and we can actually deal with confidential. And then following that, look at the lessons that we learned and actually get something that makes it clear what are the criteria for confidentiality and actually who should scrutinise confidential, because confidential decisions should not be exempt from scrutiny. And my personal view is that the right thing is that the whole scrutiny committee goes in camera. But whatever the decision, we should actually look at it properly at some stage. But I'm not sure the next meeting is the right time to do it.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. It's also just been pointed out to me that the deadline for papers for the next meeting is this Friday. So Councillor Spink, perhaps you'd agree the time between now and Friday is not a sufficient period to scope and provide the report that you're looking for on notice on the papers.
I don't necessarily concede that. The amended budget papers were only served yesterday and they should have been served several days ago, I understand. So these rules aren't always applied. I think it is such an important issue that it should not be kicked down the road. We cannot go on as a council denying the public access to documents, which then at the door of the chamber, we suddenly say, oh, you should have seen them. Cameron Palin up there might have liked to ask detailed questions. He's been denied that opportunity. I don't want the public to be denied the opportunity on Yarmouth. It's not rocket science. I'll write the paper myself and send it to the officers if you like. It's quite clear in law what is exempt and what isn't.
Councillor Spink, nobody has been denied the opportunity to comment on this report for corporate scrutiny. You've sat here and heard me confirm with the officer, this will now go into the public domain. This will be, excuse me, this will be on the agenda for March, where Councillor Palin and the rest of the general public will have the opportunity to raise questions on it. We have a clear process. There is not a cabinet report attached to this. Can I have a vote, please?
Yes.
All those in favour of putting confidentiality as a freestanding issue on the next agenda, which would require a full report by an officer in 4 days' time, raise your hand. All those in favour of leaving it to a future meeting, raise your hand. A future meeting. Sounds like you want May, Councillor Lever.
Say what the future is. Future to me in this council is you're old and can't hear me. That's amazing. So
Councillor Mossel, I will let you come in, but you are proposing to dissolve this committee in May, the Scrutiny Committee, because you've put forward a proposal to move to a committee system. So I don't want too much debate. A future meeting means May, or if this committee still exists after May.
yes, but I haven't actually proposed it, Councillor Robertson, to do. I'm on the group that all voted for a committee system. So we'll correct ourselves on that. So I haven't actually proposed the committee system. I will vote in when it comes to full council. But I think actually saying that I proposed it, I'm not leading the charge on this. I just think it's a democratic decision.
Do we
I'd
have,
just like a date that we'd look at it. That's
thank you. Do we have a show of hands, Councillor Love?
Sorry. I think we don't leave it open-ended. We say May. I'm quite happy to go for May because then we've got a target to aim for, gives the officers time. I just want to point out that this is not a new issue. We had the same issues when we had the first floating bridge, where we weren't allowed access to it, even on the day. It was the same with the island roads, issues about confidentiality. So this is not something that's new now. This is, quite rightly, needs to be dealt with once and for all. A rolling thing which has happened for a long time about what is confidential and what is not. But more importantly, if we're going to do that, then we need to look at what the implications are for us as councillors, because I refused to participate in a confidentiality thing because it was collective responsibility and it only took one person in that room to put my home and myself at risk with the island roads. We were threatened with losing our homes and being taken to court. So it's not just about the process, it's about the protection which is given to councillors when locked into confidential issues. That was a really big issue around the island roads one. So May, I would like to see May. I do take the point that you make. At the moment, we can see no further than May, depending on what happens or not. In actual fact, we as a committee need to look beyond that because I don't believe it'll be delivered in May. We want this new governance system. It can't be. There isn't enough time. That's my view. But so May, I've got no problems with May. Let's have it out. But it will need more than just being an item because we're talking about a lot of work for officers. That's the thing to look at this. And we're also looking at constitution.
Quite, councillor Love, which is why I wanted to leave it more open than May, because May is an extremely full meeting and the future governance is a item in May, which I'd like to devote a lot of time to. I don't think it's helpful adding this to May necessarily, but I sense that that's the alternative preference of this committee. So, councillor Lever.
It wasn't necessarily a preference, it was just because it was mentioned that I just wanted to be certain what we were voting on, if it was May or not, but May or a future meeting, that's absolutely fine, yeah.
May as the alternative vote. All those raise your hand. Okay, well, that's 5-3 in favour of putting it on the agenda for May, please. Thank you. Item number 6, Cowes Floating Bridge. So I'm very pleased that we have consultants with us in the room to be able to answer questions and start with making a presentation. Is there any comments you wanted to make, Mr. Rowland, before we lead into that?
Yeah, just a very brief introduction. I'll introduce you to 3S Business Review Limited, who've actually carried out the review of the floating bridge, and they are going to carry out a presentation. Once we've had the presentation, we will then flow into what the next stages are and how we were going to do that and carry that out. And I'll pass you over to Tash Dix to do that process. And we will offer opportunities throughout this presentation to take questions as well, because there's quite a lot to absorb. There's quite a lot in this presentation. So I'll pass you over to John and Steve from 3S Limited.
Okay, Steve and I are delivering this presentation between us, and when we swap over from one to another, perhaps that's the time to ask questions on the preceding section, because it's 22 slides and there's quite a lot in it. We guess we understand everybody's seen the report. This is a double-sided printing of it, so it's quite a fulsome document. But the document itself is only part of the story. Underpinning it is quite a lot of work building a digital model of the environment that the existing floating bridge operates in. Quite an important task, one that we feel might usefully have been carried out before Floating Bridge 6 was designed, but essential before any moves are made to either improve Floating Bridge 6 or commission a Floating Bridge 7. What the model seeks to do is to predict the results of modifications or design characteristics without actually going to the time and huge expense of experimentation. For example, changing the size of chains on the existing ferry might cost £250,000, and only when you finished it would you find, and plonked it in the water, would you find that it doesn't actually work. And so we set about building a digital model so that we could firstly test any remaining fixes that might be identified, and secondly to provide a firm base for any design of a replacement vessel, bearing in mind that contractors who are bidding and only bidding to supply a replacement vessel would almost certainly not go to the expense of building a digital model to do it. And the important thing for the council is that no matter where the risk lies, when this thing hits the water, it works. So this is probably two-thirds of the exercise. The other third was building the model itself. Going on to the presentation, starting off by telling you who we are. Well, there's the question. There you are. 3S is a very small company. It operates on a project-specific basis, and it was formed by us and other directors of what was, in our employed years, one of the top 10 British international consulting and project management companies. We formed this on completion of our employed existence, basically to look at projects that interested us. In our employed existence, I served as CEO of our company. I'm a business graduate. My focus was on negotiating contracts, managing risk. Steve was our engineering director, and he's got huge experience in the delivery of major systems control and transportation projects around the world. One of Steve's projects that he personally delivered was Manchester Metro. Our original company had 1,700 staff, and we worked not just in transportation, we worked in the building, environmental, power, transportation sectors. We had highway departments. We did huge amounts of PFI work. And our experience includes Channel Tunnel, Network Rail's West Coast Main Line, London Underground's Jubilee Line, Docklands Light Railway. Why do I list railway projects? Because there's a very close analogy, we feel, between a rail vehicle and the ferry. They're big lumps of kit. They're about as complex as one another. They take a lot of designing and procuring, and they really have to work.
Can we leave it till a natural break? Go on, quickly.
Quick question. I looked at all your experience and everything, and my question would be, I'm sat here at another meeting learning about floating bridges and stuff like that. When you look at the environment and everything, I know you haven't been asked it, but with your experience doing channel tunnels and stuff like that, and when I've been to Norway, etc., and all the sort of, you know, road bridges and tunnels and stuff like that, do you actually think another floating bridge, another of the same? I know you're answering your remit, but could we in the future not think, actually, instead of spending all this money on this, having a permanent road bridge or some other thing rather than just another floating bridge?
Well,
because you seem to have this vast experience. When you look at that small bit, I just wonder, you know, would that be an option in your years of experience?
Our remit was indeed to look at FB6, its failings and what might be done to rectify those failings or replace the bridge itself. A lot of work has been done in the past on other options, and in the past, Steve and I have been involved in those other discussions. In amongst it all, I think somebody asked Laura at a meeting whether a transporter bridge was an option. We wrote a paper on transporter bridges. We were asked whether a tunnel was an option, and we concluded that the tunnel would have to start somewhere just a bit this side of Wootton and would finish up at the other side of West Cowes. As far as we can see, a bridge would be a very serious impediment to tall river traffic. So, you know, whereas we haven't been asked to look at that, I think we can honestly say that a floating bridge is probably the most logical solution. Okay.
I'll take this as the first break, whether it was intended to or not, because I want to avoid just firing endless questions when people feel like it. Any more preliminary questions? Councillor Spink.
Thank you. Just following on to that, it may be that the Medina is considerably wider, but the River Yar over at Yarmouth has a bridge, and quite tall vessels, sailing vessels, go through with tall masts. And that simply has, it's not a lifting bridge, but it could be just part of it to allow boats through, and also a swivel bridge. Would that not be a possibility?
Well, they would be options. They would be options. You would have to elevate the roadway to the level of the bridge, and you can't disregard the cost of building a bridge and the associated embankments either side of it. It would be enormous, as would the cost of digging a tunnel. It depends what kind of budget you're operating with, and it also depends on utility.
Thank you. Please carry on.
Okay. I said that we work on a project-specific basis. We in fact only we only work on projects that are of personal interest to us. We're at that point in our lives where we can afford to do that, and we do. I'm a long-term resident of the Isle of Wight. I've had a house on the Isle of Wight now, and I've had a yacht here for 25 years. I spend most summers face to face with the floating bridge at one time or other during the day, and when the problems of the floating bridge became more obvious, I persuaded Steve to weigh in and help me advise the council in terms of what might best be done to overcome the various challenges. And we did a great deal of work over a long period for not just for this administration, but for the previous administration. We produced papers, for example, on side thrusters. We produced the paper I mentioned on the transporter bridge at no cost to the council. And we've been doing this for about the last 4 years, I think. But eventually, the council came to us and said and asked us if we'd put together a specific report on FB6, and in view of the huge amount of work that went into that, that was a project for which we sought payment, and that's the result of that particular contract. We at our level as directors of a major British company, we are essentially risk managers. Steve is a long way from drawing board nowadays, and I'm a long way from drafting contracts. When you got to our level, you were managing risk. You were identifying risk and packaging it up, and preferably giving it to somebody else. You either insured it, you contracted out of it, or you priced it into your project. But the key was managing risk. So when we looked at FB6 and what can be done with FB6 itself, what might be done with replacing it, we looked at it essentially as risk managers. And our first step in managing the risk was to produce a model of what risks we had and what means might best be used to overcome those risks. That's the end of our first formal break.
That's our first break, Chairman.
We had a slightly preemptive break, didn't we? But is there anything else? No, fine. Let's crack on.
Okay, good afternoon. Very pleased to be here in the auditorium, and thank you for your time. So our next slide is entitled, "What did IWC ask 3S to do?" And John's already introduced perhaps the most important part of this study, which was to arrange for the production of a computerized fluid dynamics digital model. And the key focus was to be able to create a model which would reliably replicate the performance of FB6 in the environment of the Medina in the extremes of wind and tidal forces that obviously everybody here is very familiar with. It's, you know, a very specific environment to be operating a floating bridge in. So the computerized modeling was something that, as John's already said, we would have hoped would have been done as part of the procurement of FB6, but hadn't been. But as well as the modelling, we were asked to identify potential improvements. So coming out of the model, enabling FB6 to cope better with those extreme forces. And a key objective was looking at the costs associated and the operational problems associated with the use of the push boat. Would it be possible to make changes to enable that push boat to be dispensed with? And in addition to that, in addition to looking at the physical characteristics and the actual size and shape and operation of the vessel, would it be possible to introduce some operational improvements to the way the floating bridge was being managed in service? And the key objective there, recognising that the current frequency of service isn't delivering on the 2018 business case requirement, would it be possible to introduce operational improvements to achieve an increased frequency of service and hence improved passenger revenues? So the objective, if FB6 couldn't be improved, if it turned out from that analysis that practical improvements wouldn't be possible, could we then look at the opening part of a strategy for the possible replacement of FB6? So going back to the first bullet, for the CFD modelling, we specified the objectives and parameters and identified the specialist unit at Southampton University, which is called the Wolfson unit, to build and run the model. So June last year, we opened up a dialogue with Southampton, and then we worked with them going backwards and forwards to deliver the CFD model. Now, the model, this slide on the screen here is a fairly complex slide, but this was the diagrammatic information that we provided to Southampton to say these are the issues that you need to be considering in the production of a model. So, for example, running from the top, the unwetted hull and superstructure dimensions, the maximum transit distance from east to west cows, the tidal range, the permitted depth of the chains, both trailing and in advance of the vessel, the detailed issues like the chain link configuration, the exact height that it exited the vessel above the waterline, the average vessel transit speed. I don't need to read them all out, but you can see the complexity and the variety of parameters that we asked Southampton to deal with. And one of the most important outputs is, it's probably difficult to read off the screen up there, but to the right, the variable X, which is the deviation of the course of the vessel from its no tide, no wind direct path under maximum and selected extreme values for tide and wind speed. And this is really what it's coming down to, because the evidence that was clear as we worked ahead of this particular commission was that FB6, needing the push boat under those extremes, was not tracking the optimum path across the river. So what was the modelling going to tell us in relation to that? Could the modelling point to changes to FB6, or could it be used as the underlying basis for a specification for an FB7 in due course, where those parameters could be specified or could be picked up by a design authority to create a new vessel? So with those objectives, what conclusions did we reach? Number one, due to the constraints placed on the operation of FB6, in part arising from the issue of the depth of water over the chains, we concluded that it wouldn't be possible for FB6 to achieve the 5 return crossings per hour specified by the business case. And I know that question has already been asked from the public gallery. So that was a key conclusion. What we determined from our performance analysis was that there may well be scope to streamline operating procedures to increase the average frequency from 3.4 to 4.4 return crossings per hour. Now, that might not sound like a big change, but in reality, and this probably will ring true, the current performance, which is of the order of that 3.4 return crossings per hour, is probably about the bare minimum for a public service, because much below that, and to a first approximation, it's probably better going via Newport by road. Now, time isn't everything, admittedly, but as I said, that 3.4 that's out there at the moment is really the bare minimum. So to get to 4.4 return crossings per hour, okay, it's not 5, but it's a substantial improvement. Now, in tandem with that, yes, we can improve the operational procedures. Could we modify FB6 to be able to do away without the push boat at maximum ebb tide? Sorry, a couple of bullets behind there. And what we concluded was that simply isn't possible. The CFD model, with numerous iterations, showed that for that particular vessel, you wouldn't be able to do away with the push boat. And coming out of that same model, not surprisingly, maintaining the prescribed depth of water over the chains presents a particular challenge. And our view was that to meet that challenge, largely as specified by the harbour master, again, after numerous iterations with Southampton, we concluded the only way that could possibly be achieved would be the radical redesign. So in other words, a completely different vessel. But we did think that the other use of the push boat, which is as important as maintaining the depth of water over the chains, is to do with safe berthing. We thought it might be possible to specify a vessel that would more readily achieve safer berthing without the need for the push boat that we're needing with FB6. So those were key conclusions. Some of the detail, and again, this relates partly to one of the questions that was tabled at the outset. We looked in detail at the timing. So the performance review that we did looked at the detailed timings for a number of different parameters. Now, there's the transit time. How long does it actually take to go across the river from east to west Cowes? There's the time for the loading and offloading of vehicles. There's the time for the loading and offloading of passengers. There's a turnaround delay. The ferry will arrive, it will offload, and then there's a slight delay before you can start boarding. There's what I'm terming a segregation delay, which is the delay that's required because of this need, again, specific to the Medina and the ramp, the angles on the loading ramps, the need to segregate boarding of passengers and vehicles. So there's a delay once passengers are boarded before vehicles can board, and so on and so forth. And then this particular slide, which is entitled Delay to Departure After Boarding Complete, was where we concluded that particular changes and improvements could be made. Because those other timings, unless you can speed the ferry up, and there are reasons why that may or may not be possible, they're not really within your full control. They're a function of, well, what time of day it is, how many cars have I got, how many passengers have I got. But what we observed was that once passengers and vehicles have boarded, and essentially the ferry is good to go, there is a significant delay in many cases before the ferry actually departs. And the slide that's on the screen there logs what we observed across 37 different crossings for a number of days. It was actually about a year ago. It was back in March last year, which strangely the business case also concludes is a good month to get a sort of average view of life on FB6. But across those number of days, across 37 logged crossings, the delay, once boarding complete to departure, varied significantly. And you can see on the screen, the minimum was around a minute, but we're up to examples of certainly well over 3 minutes, one there at 4 minutes. And that's saying, I'm ready to go, but I can't. Now, in some cases, that'll be because there's a large vessel coming down the Medina, so I've got to stay on berth. But the average there is about 2 minutes 30. And a key part of that delay, again from observations, is that the master currently takes a degree of detail responsibility down at the ramp and down at the gates for closing and upping the ramps before he goes up to the pilot house. And we're saying if that were changed, if the personnel were given a different set of duties, then you'd have a real chance of significantly reducing that average 2 minute 30 delay. And that's key to achieving that improvement from 3.4 crossings per hour to approximately 4.4 crossings per hour. And as I said, the key target from a time perspective being to compete with the alternative route via Newport, which we reckon means you've got to be better than about 3.75 return crossings per hour. So if you're at 4.4, then you're operating then, you know, a reasonable public service. So we think, and we've obviously been in discussion with Colin and with the councillors, we think that's a key area for focus on improving FB6, irrespective of any questions about procurement of an FB7. Now, if we go back to the modelling experience with Southampton, given that we concluded that even with heavier chains or with modifications to the structure of FB6, that we wouldn't be able to do away with the push boat, were there alternative solutions to be considered? And one particular one we looked at was looking at the implementation of a tether. And what the diagram on the screen there shows is a representation of FB6 with the chains that it's driving along, and then a tether anchor block somewhere upstream with another chain or cable attached to the ferry to stop it, you know, being pushed by the tide to the point where it's not able to cross the river satisfactorily. But what was concluded was, yes, in concept that would work, but in reality, the length of that tether would probably be about 200 metres from memory, is what Southampton came up with. So a 200-metre chain running upstream is clearly not a practical solution. So we came back to the overriding conclusion, there's not a straightforward way to do this. We have to conclude that the only way to continue operating in the extremes with FB6 is to deploy the push boat. So that's looking at the two key tasks, looking at the CFD modelling and looking at the performance review. And before I hand back to John to talk about what are the key problems with FB6, if anybody's got any questions on those particular, and I'll through the chair, obviously.
Yeah, Councillor Love.
Thank you for that. I think the report is pretty much going along the lines of what we had always said, those of us that live in that area. I think there's a couple of important things here. Is you know, it's reported £630,000 every 3 years for maintaining a push boat. We could have bought a push boat for that, which I did actually suggest in 2018, but nobody took me on for that, which could then be a launch. But the point is so that is that would be that if the floating bridge was replaced, that would be a saving representing that. But I wanted to ask a question about the chains particularly. I mean, my experience is the floating bridge is like a snail in terms of how it crawls across the river, because the chains are so loose that it's now not performing anything like. And I believe it's something in the region of, from its design specification, it's performing about 60% of what it was designed to do, of which it's reported performing 95% to that 60%. You kind of see what I'm saying?
I think that's a very good way of looking at it indeed, because, you know, is FB6 working? Well, yes, at one level it clearly is. It's there and it's running backwards and forwards. But is it delivering against the target set out in the business case? No, it isn't. The reliability, which you then factor in by the fact it's only doing 3.5 returns versus 5 returns, then immediately that 90% comes down, you know, dramatically. And the point you make there about the going at snail's pace, what we were seeing from the, you know, the fairly detailed analysis was an average transit time across the river of 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Now, I've not seen many videos of FB5, and to be honest with you, we had a lot of trouble getting any data on FB5 at all. I'm sure there are people around the table who know the answer better than I do. But looking at what I have seen, FB5 was able to rattle across there in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Now, 3 minutes, 20 seconds for FB6 is clearly, as you say, snail's pace.
Thank you.
Councillor Molsell.
having grown up with an engineer as a father, this fascinates me. He had a big workshop, was spent his life building and making things and improving things, or in some cases not improved them and they never worked again. I would just, when I look at that tether anchor block, would there be a way, and I don't know if it's possible, to have that as like a pulley system? Because if it actually, that tether moved along at the bottom of the fixed parts, it could move closer to the bridge, couldn't it?
Yes.
I'm saying.
Yeah, I see exactly what you're
If it
saying.
was a purely pulley system, the length of the tether would be less, wasn't it? If it could actually be on a system that pulled along slightly with it, then the length of that cable would be less, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Just wondering.
and perhaps the limit of that is you actually have rails across the river underneath the bridge, and it's running on those rails. Yeah, but the trouble, once you start to introduce a dynamic system like that, then you introduce the problem of dealing with, you know, debris in the river, maintenance of that system. Is it something that's worth looking at in more detail as a concept? Yes, undoubtedly. I think once it's, you know, if you were looking at replacing, then that would be something to be looked at. But as a modification to FB6, we didn't think that was going to be a practical way.
If you do decide to do that, could I have the patent now?
Any other questions before we move on? No, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Right, well, what are the main problems with FB6? Or the causes of the problems with FB6? Well, first of all, it's over 100 tons heavier than FB5. That obviously directly increases the amount of hull that's underwater. The bigger the displacement, the bigger the area of hull that's submerged, and that submerged hull then presents resistance to the tide. So the bigger, the heavier, the more pressure on the vessel, and the greater the drift. It's also longer, and it has a long profile above the water, including this glazed balustrade that surprisingly doesn't present a huge resistance compared with the underwater profile, but nevertheless contributes to the problem. So you've got a big area of submerged hull, and then you've got what effectively amounts to a sail above the water, and you've got a prevailing southwesterly wind. And when we modelled this, of course, we modelled it on maximum gust speed of wind, maximum tidal flow speed. You put those together, and you've got an unviable situation. The interesting thing is that we dug around because there weren't any drawings we could lay our hands on for FB5, but we were overcome with curiosity. How would FB5 have performed if we pulled that back out of Southampton and stuck it back in the water? Would that be the ends of the problem? And the answer to that was surprisingly no. In terms of the chain depth, when we changed the parameters to replicate FB5, or as closely as we could to replicate FB5, we still had a chain depth problem. The problem we didn't have with FB5 was a berthing problem. So whereas we would, to maintain the chain depth, and we understand that the prescribed chain depth might be quite new. It might not have existed when FB5 was designed, and FB5 might never have achieved it. But what FB5 could do was berth safely under any conditions. FB6 can't. So as far as I'm concerned, the most critical safety aspect of the pushboat is to enable the ferry to berth. I mean, bearing in mind that it's 100 tons heavier, it's wider, it's a big piece of equipment. Any impact that has on the other on either side of the river could be disastrous. And when we looked at footage of the pushboat operating, interestingly, the pushboat tends to pull away as FB6 is in the middle of the river, and it tends to come back again as it berths. So it's as if the crew of the push boat recognise that the primary problem here is berthing and not depth of chains. But no matter what we do with the model, we can't dispose of the berthing problem. So interestingly, the solution isn't, as a lot of people might like to feel, solved by bringing FB5 back. It's a rather bigger problem than that. This is difficult to see from down there, I guess, but this is an interesting illustration of showing FB5's dimensions overlaid on FB6, FB5 being in red and FB6 being in black. And you can see that, you know, this huge area of balustrade acting as a sail. You can see the increased length, but a couple of other interesting things is that FB5 is actually much narrower and has a completely different configuration fore and aft, which means that in terms of berthing, it can berth much more successfully in extreme conditions. The other thing that it shows on the far right hand side are these enormous chain wheels. They're about 2 meters in diameter. They're the same chain wheels, or very similar chain wheels, on FB5 to FB6, and they actually dictate the maximum draft of the vessel. So as long as you have those 2 meter chain wheels, the draft of the two vessels will be very similar, which means that the ability to design a hull that has that is more hydrodynamically efficient is reduced by virtue of the fact that you've got a fixed minimum draft. If it were possible to replace those chain wheels with with smaller wheels or twin wheels or some other system, then you could do much more to optimize the dynamics. The other interesting thing, and to me it appears to be almost a design oversight, is that if you look at FB5, the roots of the roots of the ramps, the loading ramps, are much lower than on FB6, and that's been achieved by curving the deck. So the deck on FB5 is a very distinct curve, and the height of the ramp roots are much closer to the ground, and it's the difference between that and the configuration of FB6 that gives rise to this problem we've got with cars grounding. We also looked at some of the original, we think there were original design drawings, and when the FB6 ramps were designed, instead of being designed to achieve an acceptable angle with the concrete ramp, they were projected onto a flat surface. So somebody appears to have ignored the actual slope of the ramp. So if you went to a new vessel, then I mean, it's very difficult to see that you could do anything with the existing vessel. But if you went to a new vessel, then some basic re-engineering around those ramps could eliminate an awful lot of the operational problems with FB6, because we suspect that an awful lot of the delay in service is due to people zigzagging onto the existing vessel, and an awful lot of traffic might well have been lost to people who really do not want to lose the front scuttle of their car on boarding FB6.
Are we near a natural break?
Let's get to the end of the next slide.
Yeah.
One more slide. Yeah, let's get to the end of the next slide. So what design changes are necessary? We are not marine engineers. we work on the basis that we very valuably know what we don't know. We can point out what we think, but the trick at the end of the day is to find somebody that does know what you don't know. So we don't pretend to be marine engineers and capable of designing solutions. What we can do is to point out what we think the problems are and what solutions we think there might be available for other people to evaluate in detail. But it's fairly clear that a lighter, smaller vessel would go an awful lot further towards resolving the berthing issue, and might assist. There's a lot of debate to be had around this. Might assist in resolving some of the chain depth issue. Steve has been steaming on since when did we produce this report? November. He's produced all sorts of other little computer models, including one that demonstrates that the increase in the number of car spaces on FB6 above FB5, in fact, achieves nothing for the actual capacity of the system. So reducing the size of the vessel back to 15 cars from 19 would make no difference whatsoever. So there is there's good opportunity to reduce the size of the vessel, increase capacity as a result of that by increasing speed. The other interesting thing is that when talking about lighter vessels, when FB6 was specified, it was specified that it should be made of steel. We're not quite sure why it should be made of steel, or not aluminium or composite. But if it were made of aluminium, then you'd have a weight saving of about 30% over steel. Again, smaller, lighter vessel. The lighter it is, the less drag. So we think that greater hydrodynamic efficiency of hull design and a smaller topside profile would provide a great deal of improvement to the dynamic performance of the vessel. But the one thing that is for sure is that the CFD model that we now have would be extremely important in testing further design concepts to ensure that any innovative design works in practice, bearing in mind that people bidding to provide a vessel are very unlikely to spend a great deal of money speculatively producing a specific CFD model for this particular ferry. So if the council doesn't provide it, it won't be there as part of the process. And as far as the council is concerned, no matter who the risk is with, it will want this to work on the day.
Thank you. I've just noticed I've got a hand up from a member of the public online. If you can hear me, I'm sorry, we're not able to take questions from members of the public outside the public question time at the beginning of the meeting. So I'm unable to come to you. I'm sorry about that. Can I come to Councillor Mosdell? Did you have a question? I've certainly got a few. I think this is the meaty part of the report. Councillor Mosdell.
Thank you. There's on page 35, just before the FB5 and FB6 dimensional comparison, there's two lines that say the support theories of recent increases in maximum tidal depth, tidal ebb speed, whether due to subsequent marine works or silting. It also indicates the solution is not simply to replicate FB5. Can you explain more about what changes, subsequent marine works and things like that, and silting has happened that you think has caused this effect,
Just a second.
not helped?
You're looking at the report, are you? Oh, just the slides I put up. I thought you said page 35.
Oh, of your pack. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Slide 21.
Right, okay. Yep.
Sorry. So it's the two bottom paragraphs,
Yeah.
points that say This supports theories of recent increases in maximum tidal ebb speed, whether due to subsequent marine works or silting. It also indicates that the solution is not simply to replicate FB5. Could you explain just a bit more about the subsequent marine works and the silting?
Well, we have a new breakwater. There are a number of commentators who say that the construction of that breakwater has bottled up the ebb tide that then suddenly releases and produces a much faster speed than previously. We have no means of testing that theory, absolutely none. But if FB5's performance has deteriorated, its theoretical performance has deteriorated. If it worked before and it doesn't work now, and there are arguments that maybe it didn't work before, but if something has changed, that could be one of the some things that changed. The other something that might have changed is that, of course, the shallower the river, the smaller the cross-sectional area, the faster the water is going to flow through it. So if there's been any silting over the period, then that could have increased the tidal, but we have no data for that at all. It might well be that desilting that area of the river would slow the tidal speed down and make operations that much easier. We don't know. That might be precluded by submarine cables. Certainly there's been, as far as we can see, there has been no desilting work carried out for as long in living memory. So it might well be that it's got shallower. We don't know. It might well be that the breakwater has caused a tidal effect that makes things more challenging, but we don't know. But we mentioned the possibility.
Can I just ask, and I'll come to you, Councillor Drew, just trying to drill down on the problems or the inconclusive elements of your modelling. In your report on page 3, when it talks about chain depth, I think you're saying that, I think you said it in this meeting, that even floating bridge 5 would appear to need a push boat if it were brought back into operation. And in fact, you couldn't provide a model for and I appreciate you're not designers, but a model for a vessel that wouldn't require or might not require a push boat.
Whether it needs a push boat or not depends on the sort of demands of the harbour master in terms of chain depth. It might be possible to negotiate a relaxation with him, but it certainly wouldn't require a push boat for berthing purposes. So FB6 requires a push boat for berthing purposes, even if the chain depth is just forgiven as a criterion. FB5 wouldn't need a push boat for berthing purposes, but if the chain depth requirement was strictly applied, then yes, it would need a push boat because it wouldn't be able to reach it wouldn't be able to achieve that criteria otherwise.
And I think there is potentially a problem in that if you need a push boat for one job, it doesn't really matter whether it's got to do 2 or 3 jobs. That if a new floating bridge 5, for example, were to be designed, the fact that it might have a push boat means there continues to be a possibility of a liability for 600,000 over 3 years. I take the point that this is not a conclusive report, but I think the fact that we can't rule out a push boat presents an ongoing problem for a decision for the council, in my opinion, because to redesign a floating bridge and for it to still need a push boat at some time would be deeply embarrassing.
Which is why we've produced a CFD model.
And your CFD model, and I'm not. This is not a criticism.
No.
Extremely helpful information.
No, but
the model cannot conclude at the moment that you would be able to design something without a push boat. And it may be the answer lies with a conversation with that Cowes Harbour Commission, but at the moment, we cannot exclude a push boat from a
Well,
future
It might,
design.
it might go back to a renegotiation with Cowes Harbour Commission. It might, on the other hand, require a more radical hull design. As I've said, that the maximum draft is dictated by the chain wheels. If you had a different chain drive system, if, for example, you had twin wheels, you could lift that maximum draft and distribute the displacement in a different way across the hull. I mean, there are lots of ifs in this, but as far as we're concerned, the number one critical issue is safety in berthing, and FB6 cannot berth safely without a push boat. FB5 could and did.
Yeah, I would still make the point that if a push boat has to be on site, well, it may as well do the berthing job if it's got to be doing keeping the maximum depth. You know, if it's got to be there for one purpose,
Yeah,
it will do two.
Chair,
Yeah.
Chair,
I was going to come to Councillor Drew, but I think this is very
think-
relevant to
I think
this.
sorry, I think we need to be fairly clear. So Floating Bridge 5 operated on exactly the same chains. So that's the first thing, and it did not need a push boat ever.
But we cannot be sure that the environment hasn't changed, and I think that's
No,
very clear. We
the-
cannot be sure that
The
environment
environment has
exists.
changed minuscule, and the people who have that data are Cowes Harbour Commission. They have that data, and they have said to me in meetings that it is a minuscule change in terms of speed, and that would not affect. So the point is that Floating Bridge 6 was built on chains which were completely inappropriate. They were built, Floating Bridge 6 was put onto exactly the same weight of chains that Floating Bridge 5 operated on. And that is part of the problem, because the chains, as we've heard, are not heavy enough to hold it in place. So the point is that FB5 operated absolutely with no trouble whatsoever on those chains at 90 tons less than currently. So even a small amount of change would not, a small amount of increase in the river speed would have little or no impact on that.
That's not what this report is saying, and the environment might have changed because of the Cowes Harbour Commission's decision. That is an environmental factor in and of itself, if different requirements are asked. The modelling in this has said, at the moment, if Floating Bridge 5 were to come back, we cannot demonstrate that it also wouldn't need a push boat. That's what's in the report, and I appreciate that it's not a conclusion.
It's not accurate to the data.
No.
Well, if you want to question the report not being accurate, that's why we're here. But I'm going with what's in the report at the moment.
Yeah.
Mr. Rowland, and then I'll bring in Councillor Drew.
Yeah, we're not, sorry, we're not talking about bringing back FB5.
Similar design.
No,
Forgive
we're
me
not
if I'm wrong. Your report says if, and I'll tell you what, I'll quote from it. That would be much better. Surprisingly, despite the considerably smaller waterline length and displacement of FB5, the CFD model predicts that vessel deflection at extreme hydrodynamic wind and tidal forces is sufficient for FB5 to also breach minimum chain clearance. So unless there is a change to that minimum chain clearance requirement, your model shows that FB5 or a very similar design would also breach.
Correct. But that's saying, that's why we're concluding that the answer is not to bring back FB5, as has been talked about potentially in the past. Bring back FB5 because FB5 worked satisfactorily. The model is telling us, no, it wouldn't comply with the depth of the chains requirement. So what we're saying later on is that the CFD modelling going forward, if it were decided to procure a replacement vessel, would be focused on a radical redesign of the hull and the superstructure. So we're not saying that there is a risk that a push boat will be required, whatever. One of the requirements is that we must not have a push boat. Now, only if, after numerous iterations, it was concluded that it's impossible to operate anything without a push boat. Well, that's a different scenario. All we're saying at the moment is FB5 would not comply with the depth of water of the chain requirement.
Thank you, that's helpful. I noticed in the final bullet point there is surprisingly, even at 0 values for longitudinal wetted area.
Yeah,
and
this was a
topside
very
area.
interesting conclusion, and I think, you know, this is one of the conclusions that came out of that modelling process that demonstrated the real tangible value of going through that modelling. Because what it said, and this took some getting our heads around, to be honest with you, it said even if the vessel that were on the chains had 0 face onto the river, it would still get pushed down the river in extreme ebb tide conditions. The reason being the drag on the chains themselves. So the tide the current operating on the chains, irrespective of any vessel that you might have there, was sufficient to take the thing off course. Now that's that's not an intuitive conclusion by any means. So that, and you know, without the model, people probably wouldn't believe that if you just said it.
Because your report says that the ferry would also need to be substantially smaller even than FB5 in order to avoid breaching minimum chain clearance.
Yeah, now
So
that
it seems to me the big issue is the rules over minimum chain clearance.
well, that's that's been presented to us as an overriding requirement from the harbour master. And if you accept that at face value, then yes, it's key. I think what we're saying here is, in order to have any prospect of running a vessel that complies with the minimum chain depth requirement, it's going to be a radically different hull design. And I think we also say somewhere, if that still proves not to be acceptable, then it's got to be detailed discussions with the harbour master. And one of the points we're making in one of the later slides is that detailed discussion with the harbour master has to happen before you do anything looking at procuring a different vessel. Take the point there from Carl, times past, things have operated quite happily, even if the chain depth wasn't being maintained. So is there an operational scenario that says, well, on occasion, actually, we can live with this? Question for the harbour.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I've got lots of hands up. I don't know, Mr. Rowland, whether you wanted to come in or.
I think John and Steve have said most of it. The harbour master, from my understanding, and I wasn't here in 2016-17, was concerned about the health and safety of the chain depth and Floating Bridge 5, which hadn't been specified before. And that's why the harbour master specified quite deliberately on Floating Bridge 6 that the chain depth had to be an issue. And that's where that's where we've got to where we are. The other point that Stephen and John said is that Floating Bridge 5 didn't have issues with berthing, which is one of the big reasons why we've got the push boat, because of the bigger size of Floating Bridge 6 and making sure that it aligns with the slipways, whereas Floating Bridge 5 had more of an issue with the chain depth. But it wasn't an issue with the harbour master at the time, so it wasn't something that was addressed as Floating Bridge 5.
And it seems to me, and that's why we're discussing this, that's absolutely crucial, is the harbour master's views over chain depth. And it's going to be very hard to bring a new floating bridge into being, operational being, without some renegotiation of that. Councillor Drew.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for a brilliant report. And apologies if this is something of an obvious question, but you seem to be suggesting that one of the principal issues is berthing, the time that takes. And I was just wondering, and apologies if I've missed it, in terms of, is it even possible to ameliorate those issues with a redesign of the slipways? Is there going to be any type of marginal gain, or is that essentially going to be, again, a variable that can't really be identified?
Yeah, I think our view is that it is more a question of redesigning the boat, because it's the slipways themselves are probably fine. It's the sort of throat on the approach to the slipways. And as I understand it, there's been concerns again expressed by the harbour master in the past that if you put more approach containment on, then that's too far out in the river, and that causes a problem in itself. So as I understand it, yes, there's not a great deal that can be done there.
I think the next, Councillor Jarman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. Would it be correct to summarise and characterise what you've said, that this is in effect a profound failure of design, which cannot realistically be rectified by modification? And if that is the case, that it's a failure of design, would the modelling technology which you've now used have been available at the time to the original designers?
Yeah, it's very, when you look back at the procurement process for FB6, there's a sentence in the, I think it's the invitation to tender for the design contract, which places the onus on the successful designer to demonstrate an understanding of the operation and performance of FB5. Now, to my mind, that was critical. And we've not seen all the documentation, but I don't believe that that requirement has actually been responded to, because we've seen nothing that demonstrated that the designer did have an understanding of how FB5 worked, such that FB6 could be designed with that experience. Now, at the time, CFD modelling could have been deployed to generate something of real value for FB6. And undoubtedly, that would have demonstrated this the sensitivity to sizing and width and so on and so forth. So yes, it could have been done. Why wasn't it? Very good question. Why wasn't it picked up in the the contract management overseeing the designer's response to that particular requirement? Yeah, it's a failure, certainly. When we got involved in this, and it's been quite some time now, and it was evident, everyone was saying, well, look, FB6 isn't working properly. Why is that? And my question right at the outset wasn't, well, why isn't FB6 working? My question was, why did FB5 work? And I think only now, when we've seen this output from Southampton, are we able to answer that question. And the answer is, well, actually, it probably didn't in terms of the chain depth requirement, but it did in several other important aspects. Key to the conclusion being, you need a smaller vessel, whatever you're looking at here. Yes, it probably needs a radical redesign, but you need something smaller than FB6. And you read some of the comments in the press and people say, well, that's absolutely obvious, but it needs to be actually quantified, which is what this work from Southampton has enabled us to do.
Sorry, Chair, can I just summarise that? So yes, it was a major design failure at the beginning, and yes, the technology that you've employed in modelling was available to the original designers.
Correct.
Thank you.
Councillor Redjar.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your.
Sorry, could one addendum to that? Yes, a failure in however you look at it. The other problem was the council actually specified in the tender documentation the length of the vessel. Now, yeah, that was putting the wrong emphasis on that whole design. Yeah, to the point that damages were attached. So if the subsequent supplier didn't meet the length of the vessel, damages would be claimed, and that's just not a suitable use of damages, and it's not a proper way to specify a design requirement.
Councillor Redjar.
Thank you, Chair. Just for clarity, could you explain in a little bit more depth about what minimum chain depth means, just in layman's terms? And you seem to have alluded to there's been a change in that since FB5 and FB6. Could you explain that a little bit more? Thank you.
Best way to answer that question is one of the appendices to the detailed report includes the harbour master's instructions on maintaining depth of water over the chains, because it's not simply that there has to be a 1.5 metre clearance. There's a 2-page explanation of exactly what that chain depth requirement is.
Introduced. But this was introduced.
Yes, which was.
Yeah, this was a criterion that was introduced. It's not a standing criterion that's been there since God wore short trousers. It was introduced sort of with FB6. So the operators down the river there will say, well, FB5 didn't achieve this, and you're right. If you're going to stick strictly to that operating criteria, you might need a push boat for that purpose. But it's all a question of degree. It could be a matter of negotiation. it might not be so critical that it can't be negotiated out. But the one thing that you can't dispose of is a need for a push boat for FB6 for berthing.
No, thank you.
To us,
Yeah.
that's the most
Yeah.
critical. That's the safety critical issue.
Councillor Drew, then Councillor Lever, and then Councillor PC Wilcox.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned that there was damages attached to the contract term in relation to the size, the length of the boat. Is that correct? Have I misunderstood? That seems quite extraordinary. In your experience, would you say that that is the case? And I mean, I'm not particularly aware, and apologies, it may have been promulgated actually who drew up the contracts in the first place, but I don't know whether that's something that you gentlemen are aware of, whether to your mind it was drawn up in-house within the council or whether it was an external advisor. I'm just very surprised by that penalty clause in the contract. But I think my main question is, in your experience within this sector, is that unusual?
We were very surprised too. It's not something use liquidated damages to to enforce, to be honest. But just specifying the length of the vessel was quite strange as well. Yes, it was inappropriate.
Sorry, there's a quick follow-up question to that in relation. You mentioned about the specification of steel versus aluminium. To what extent would that have made an impact in terms of, is it possible to roughly quantify the difference? And based on that, what was specified in the marine engineer designs? Was it aluminium, or it was up to the actual builder to pursue? I just wonder if there were cost implications as to why that was chosen.
The council specified that it should be steel. The weight saving, should it be aluminium, according to boat builders we've spoken to in the course of our report, is about 30%. So built of aluminium with, and there has to be some steel involved in the construction, but on average, an aluminium vessel of that size would displace 30% less than a steel vessel.
Councillor Lever and then Councillor Love.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if you'll know this or whether it was what you said before about somebody else would then need to come in and look at the solutions. But is it possible to, from what we know now, based on the modelling, is it possible to work backwards to determine what length a new vessel would need to be to operate on the chains that we've got at the moment? Is that possible to do through the modelling? What I'm getting at is I don't want us to go through a new vessel and then it doesn't end up working again because we've got the wrong measurements again. I want some level of certainty that if we go for a new vessel, we're confident it will achieve the, what was it, 2 meters depth on the
Quad.
yeah berthing.
It's a bit like going into a sweet shop and saying, "What have you got for threepence?" Isn't it really? It's one parameter that will be looked at in an iterative design process. You would use the CFD model. You'd feed your various parameters into it. Chain weight. One of the reasons the chains on the current on FB6 are the same as on FB5 is because it was decided that it was cheaper to keep despite the fact that the ferry weighed 100 tons more, it was cheaper to keep the old chains than buy new ones. But it's an iterative design process, and you would if you were using chains rather than cables, then you would design it such that the chains are the right chains for the vessel. You wouldn't try to work back to a situation where you could use the old chains and build the ferry around it.
Councillor Love.
Thank you. I think what's really important for me is to stay focused as much as we can on the report, because what we don't want to do is get back into a position where we're scrutinising a decision that's already been made previously. What we want to do is, from my perspective, is look at where we are now and what's happening now and moving forward because otherwise I'm just starting to wonder if we're starting to try and scrutinize things that are now gone and done and we can't change. Of course, we want to learn from that without any doubt. We know, for instance, that more than 1,000 changes were made to the design of the hull after it had actually been started to be built. We know that we had a different contractor building the vessel from actually designing the vessel. What we really need is, and I've said this all along, is the river has a finite life of its own on which you can put a vessel. And it seems to me that what we tried to do as a council, again, I don't want to really screw, is say what we want from this is more capacity for vehicles, more capacity for foot passengers, and build us something that'll deliver that. What we need to say is deliver something that works on this river. Now, we've talked about, we're not talking about bringing back the old floating bridge, because hopefully in this day and age, you wouldn't have a wheel, you'd have a different propulsion system. Hopefully it would be all electric, it would be slimmer, it would be completely. So let's not talk about what was, and let's really focus on, so we know that happened, to be honest. We know, what are we going to do to move forward? It's the solutions that I think really, really matter. So, and I know it's easy for us all to slip back into that, he said, they said, we did, they did, let's try not to do that. Let's just try and look at what this model tells us now, which is, well, bridge 5 is not going to come back, but something of a similar shape and size might work. So that's the learning, which might be aluminium or whatever. Whoever specified whatever specified has been done. There's no point in going back to that, in my view. We just say, okay, what we need to say is, rather than us saying we want this from a floating bridge, which is basically going backwards and forwards, getting vessels across, but you design it. We're not going to put anything in there, which is what you're saying has happened. Somebody said we want it a certain length without even knowing what that length was. I'm saying, look at what actually works. That's where we need to be. So sorry, I don't want to go back, because I don't think it's helpful to anybody in the past. I think what matters now is where we are. If we can modify 6, then all's good and well, but it's looking and sounding like we can't. And if there's hope for something different, let's get on and do it.
Councillor Drew.
Thank you, Chair. No, I take your point, Councillor Love, and I do agree absolutely. I think that the reason that I raise this is, I appreciate that. My fundamental frustration from what I've seen in 3 years at council of our inability to tender contracts effectively, and when they are tendered, and indeed when we have scrutiny of them, going to Councillor Spink's points, that they are shrouded in confidential issues. So I think what I'm concerned with is whether we are going out to tender with a turnkey solution, whether it's a BDO solution, we need to find a way of ensuring that this is absolutely watertight, and essentially the people of Cowes deserve something which is not going to be a problem. I just don't know where that, as it were, that cancer lies within the council in terms of, I think it's, a lacuna. I don't think any individual department or person is to blame, but fundamentally, I've seen quite a few contracts drawn up that seem extraordinary with the lacunas that have been included, or the oversight. And this is absolutely something we cannot repeat. So I think, I take your point, Councillor, I think we need to be talking about what the contract will look at, how risk is mitigated, and I think perhaps we could bring in Mr. Springate on that point of how we can look at the construction going forwards.
Yeah, I suspect I'm aware there's still a fair bit more of your presentation. Yeah, so let's deal with that, and we might sweep all the remaining issues and questions up right at the end. So if you can just plough on, thank you.
Thank you. So now, to be honest, Carl, you've just done some of this, but could a new vessel offer other benefits? And as we've said, a smaller vessel operating more frequently, when you look at it in detail, could deliver an increase in daily capacity. Again, that's not necessarily intuitive, but it makes you wonder, and perhaps this is one area we talked about design failings. This is perhaps the one area of the business case that could now be criticised, that sufficient investigation didn't go into, well, why are you increasing the number of cars carried from 15 to 19 or 20, because in fact, when you look at that in more detail, that's really not achieved anything. In fact, it's probably taken things backwards. So could a new vessel be offered other benefits? Yes, it could. Another key thing from the performance review, looking at the detailed timing assessments that we did, loading of vehicles is a key factor. You know, trying to get 20 vehicles on and off takes 2 minutes in itself before you start on FB6. So that has to be reduced. So a new vessel offering far more practical approach angles would speed up vehicle loading. And as John's already mentioned, then people are going to be more attracted to using the ferry if they've got low slung vehicles. A more radical redesign of the ramps would allow us to revisit this, again, key question on the Medina about segregation of passengers and cars for improving passenger safety and further speed loading. And we've had some discussions with people in the industry as to how that might be achieved. So again, you need a new vessel to do it. This is the point you've just raised, and we looked at this, 3 or 4 years ago now, working with Danfoss over in Sweden, with the Scandinavian experience there of electric motorization for ferries. These days, this is almost a no-brainer. Replacement of diesel with electric motors, you know, one moving part, not pistons and so on and so forth, would reduce maintenance requirements, servicing downtime, noise levels, you know, very substantially. This is not at the margins. This would be a major improvement. Along with the aluminium construction that we're suggesting, an electric boat would be lighter in any event, eliminate the refueling requirements, greater power and torque, so we can look to be, you know, accelerating more quickly to improve crossing speeds. Is that going to be with chains? Is that going to be with cables? It's, you know, you've got to look at this as part of a system, but can it go more quickly across the river? Yes, a new vessel would have to. And there's the political angle to this, if you like, of the achievement of the Isle of Wight's net zero commitments. So a new vessel would offer all sorts of opportunity for other improvements. Now, the question is, if we were to look at a new vessel, how do we set about procuring it? And I'll hand back to John for that slide.
Thank you very much. One of the absolute key principles in procuring major complex bits of electrical mechanical kit, whether it's a rail car that we're more used to or whether it's a ferry, is you do not ever try to tell the builder what he's going to build. Because if you tell him what he's going to build, it's round your neck. And with FB6, of course, we told him how long it was going to be. We told him how many cars it had to carry. We told him this, we told him that, we told the other thing. And when it didn't work, that happened. To make it even worse, instead of having somebody contracted to design and build it, we had one outfit designed to do a conceptual design and another outfit contracted to do the detailed design and build it. And so you had interfaces coming out of your ears. Very, very difficult to establish clear accountability in that kind of situation. And that becomes particularly important when this isn't a standard piece of kit. This is almost a prototype. It's a one-off. As I, at the very beginning, I said that, you know, we in our careers have become risk managers. That is no way to manage risk. The way to manage risk is to produce a very simple and very clear performance specification that actually tells the potential suppliers what you actually want this thing to do. Not what you want it to look like or how big you want it to be, what you want it to do. How long you want it, how quickly you want it to cross the river, maybe in terms of how many crossings over a period rather than a speed, how many vehicles you expect to transport, maybe again in terms of over a period rather than specifying the capacity, but you tell the supplier what you want it to do. And that's called a performance specification. That's not what we did with FB6. So that would be absolutely crucial. As I've said here, for example, to be capable of transporting a given number of vehicles in its normal daily cycle rather than specifying the vehicle size or capacity. And then you place a contract with an accredited company who will adopt the performance specification as if it wrote it itself. So if you don't agree with our performance specification, don't bid, or tell us what's wrong with it so it can be modified and then adopt it. So that at the end of the day, you don't have that situation. You can place full accountability on one outfit to design it, build it, deliver it, and guarantee that it's going to work. So what we would do is appoint what we would call a single turnkey contractor, a turnkey supplier, so that the council isn't exposed to any risk whatsoever on any part of the process. It decides what it wants, it tells the designer and supplier what it wants, and if it doesn't work, it's down to the designer and supplier. I'm perhaps overemphasizing this, but it's one of the most important things that come out of FB6. Then, if the thing doesn't work, the turnkey contract placed on the contractor would allow the council to recover liquidated damages to the extent that that's appropriate, or reject the vessel and extract damages. So, you know, that to us is the sort of the natural contracting regime. How might the council pay for a new ferry? Well, in the back of the report, we've included nothing terribly clever, nothing cleverer than a list of all the applications of cable and chain ferries around the world. I think there are 330 of them. There is probably a ready market for FB6 should the council elect to sell it. And because it doesn't work in the environment in which it is now placed, doesn't mean it's not a valuable piece of kit in the right environment. Very few other operating situations would impose tidal speeds of maximum of 2 meters a second on it. You know, in any other environment, it would work perfectly well. And I think we've said in the report it's probably worth between £1.5 million, and there should be a ready market for it. If you go for if the council decides, because there are various ways of procuring a new ferry, you can buy it, you could lease it, or you could issue a license to a supplier to design, build, own, and operate it for you. You effectively sell him a license. If you decide to buy it, then of course it's the fact that you can't sell FB6 until the end, so that you'd probably have to make, well, you would have to make progress payments. So you've got cash flow issues that you'd have to deal with. An alternative is to lease the vessel from a designer builder. If the lease includes maintenance, and then the supplier relieves the council of the risk in availability and reliability, and that leaves only the interface arising from the council's responsibility to staffing the vessel and managing its day-to-day operations. So you've still got an interface, and you know, and the supplier, well, it's broken, but you broke it. The way of eliminating that perhaps is by selling a license, so that whoever supplies and designs and supplies the vessel operates it for you as well. Then the council has no interfaces and no risks. But it's there's there's a spectrum here, and it's you know, there are lots of opportunities that the council can consider for, you know, procurement of a new vessel and along that range. Could be, you know, it could be anywhere along the range, but in whatever circumstance, the objective's got to be for the council to avoid the risk that it incurred on FB6. Where does it leave users and taxpayers? If in any situation where the council sells a license to somebody to design, build, own and operate the vessel, it would, as part of the arrangement, obviously, at least to me, impose restrictions on the ability of the operator to increase fares. We wouldn't want all the evils of privatisation. But given greater efficiency and hence ridership, if we had a reliable service, that we had car-friendly ramps, we minimised the downtime so that the ferry, instead of being out of service for regular maintenance, is out of service for only a very short period every year, then it would attract a great deal more traffic. If it attracted a great deal more traffic, then the public might even benefit from fares being reduced. Whereas over recent times, fares have increased, probably reflecting to some extent the reduction in ridership. If that provides a private operator with excessive profits, then again, in the contract that can be addressed. You can claw back a portion of those excessive profits with anti-embarrassment provisions. If you make too much profit, we claw some back. You haven't, no. We believe, and this is sort of a priori. We believe that many users may well have abdicated from use of the ferry by virtue of its reliability issues, damage to their vehicles, and we think they can be won back, and we think probably in that situation revenues can be increased quite substantially, even if the decision is taken to reduce fares. A vehicle lessor or a DBO licensee who picks up the responsibility to operate the system, of course, is going to be, whether it's a lessee or whether it's a design build operator, is going to be very concerned to absolutely minimise the amount of service downtime, and that will benefit the travelling public as well. So where do we go from here? Is it replacement? The report contains a great deal of detail on the whole question of replacement. It's a complete section. We haven't tried to replicate it in this slide presentation, but it's there to be read. It's for the council to decide, you know, which of the available options it wants to take. Does it want to buy one outright? Does it want to lease it? There are all sorts of, I'm sure, political as well as practical issues at play there, but it's for the council to decide. But the fees, but whatever is done, it must depend on the production of a performance specification, not a hardware specification. It depends on the likely cost of a compliant vessel. It depends on the availability. If you want to look at lease arrangements or DBOO operate, it depends on the availability of suppliers. You know, perhaps there's nobody interested. It will require the development of appropriate terms and conditions. There's quite a lot of work to do. And if FB6 is to be sold, then that's another major exercise in itself, you know, deciding quite how that's going to be managed and how it's going to be offered and who to and so on and so forth. Another big package of work. Replacing MB6 is only one of a number of optional solutions. The immediate operation, the thing that perhaps should be done right away, is optimising the performance of the existing vessel. From Steve's investigations, there appear to be opportunities to do that, and to the extent there are opportunities to do that, those opportunities we think should be taken immediately. We were talking earlier about the tunnels and bridges. Well, you know, somebody in the past has talked about discontinuing the service altogether. Well, that's for the council. That's for the council's decision. But whatever the council decides, we've got cost, time, social, macroeconomic, environmental, all sorts of factors. It's outside our brief. All we are looking at, or we've looked at, is the opportunity to either repair or replace what we have. But assuming that we're replacing the ferry, the first thing to decide is the procurement route. Is it going to be an outright purchase? Is it going to be a lease? You'll need an executive steering group. You'll need to appoint procurement advisors. You'll need to appoint a project team, agree a form of contract, identify any requirements for external technical advisors, prepare an outline budget, which is absolutely key, because you can't get terribly far unless you know quite how much money there is on the table. You can't decide to buy one unless you know broadly what it's going to cost.
Apologies. Right, so following the preparatory work, the principal pre-procurement work packages that we see, procurement plan, essential. This has got to be planned through. It's got to have a detailed timeline against which people can be held to account. We are looking at scheduling the key performance criteria. We've talked about the necessity to generate a performance specification, but in order to do that, we need to have a pretty broad view of what the performance criteria that we're going to be specifying have to be. So we need to look far and wide at all the various issues associated with operating a floating bridge across the Medina. And there are obvious ones and there are less obvious ones. They've all got to be considered, discussed, documented, and then, only then, would we produce what I'm calling here a provisional performance specification. So we'd look at everything from the various viewpoints and produce a provisional document. We'd also look at the associated civil works and power supply provision required for an electric operation and develop outline scopes of work, but only outline, just to make sure again that we're considering the various associated works that need to be conducted. This is key. We need to have a schedule of key stakeholders who have to be consulted prior to finalising the design for a new floating bridge. We've already talked about the harbour master. The harbour master is clearly, you know, one of the linchpins in this. His views on chain depth and other operations issues have got to be taken into account. It's got to be a genuine consultation. It's got to be backwards and forwards discussion to arrive at the optimum. Compromise is probably the right word, because nobody's going to get everything that they want, but we need to have something that is a practical compromise. We've been talking earlier today, the other people who perhaps weren't consulted as fully as they should have been were the guys actually operating this day to day, you know, out there, the understanding of how this really works on the river. Let's get them in as key stakeholders. They're important people. They'll have the tricks that need to be adopted to make things work better. So it sounds a little bit like out of the textbook for creating a business case, just, you know, consultation with the stakeholders, everybody nods their head. It's absolutely essential for this one, because as John's already said, in many ways, this is another prototype. And then the updated business case. A lot of work done for the 2018 final business case, a lot of very, very good work that can be reviewed and taken forward, but certain aspects of that business case need to be revisited, rewritten, reviewed, signed off. So that's key. leading up to pre-qualification. What are the pre-qualification criteria? What are we going to be looking at for potential providers of a new floating bridge? Obviously, we've got to go through the nuts and bolts of this, publishing the procurement notice, publishing the intention, the invitation to pre-qualify, and then obviously assessing the responses we get to that against these agreed performance criteria and evaluating those respondents' views, particularly, and this is where we learn back from the marketplace, what's the feasibility of delivering the new floating bridge against your stated performance specification? Yes, we might say we want something. The market will tell us, is that practical? The market will also tell us, actually, you're underselling yourselves. You've said you want something, we can do better than that. So evaluating the respondents' views prior to updating what was a provisional performance specification and coming up with a final document that everyone signed up to as a practical deliverable solution. And following that, having gone through the pre-qualification exercise, we can be determining the select list of potential tenderers. That may be a long list, it may be a very short list, but that's where we need to get to. And having established that, we're then into the next phase of the process. I'll let John talk about.
Yes, invitation to tender for contract award. We've got to, sorry, invitation to tender for contract award. We've got to agree the tender evaluation criteria. We've got to issue an invitation to tender showing that we will require, we can't compare apples with oranges here. We will have to specify that there's to be a mandatory compliant main bid plus non-compliant alternatives. But the non-compliant alternatives are probably at the end of the day, or could well be at the end of the day, more important than the compliant main bid. But you need a compliant main bid in order to be able to compare apples with apples. We've got to respond to bidders' questions and clarification requirements. And then it comes down to evaluating the tenders and selecting the preferred bidder, making very plain that the council is not bound to accept the cheapest offer. It's the most appropriate offer for the circumstances and to deliver the performance requirements. And then it's a question of negotiating conducting contract final negotiations and award. What do we need to do following contract award? Well, it's pretty obvious if you're actually buying a vessel, you've got to manage the procurement. But to be perfectly honest, if you're going to place a lease contract or even a design, build, own, operate, the ultimate objective is to make sure that what you actually put in place works, which means that it's going to have to be supervised. So you will still need conceptual and detailed design reviews at key milestones. Even if somebody else is taking the responsibility for, the ultimate product, we want to make sure that it works when it hits the water. Monthly contract management meetings. Change control. Was it somebody said that there were 1,000 changes to FB6? Yeah, there'll be changes here. Change control is absolutely crucial. Be right on top of change control so that you don't dilute the supplier and the designer and supplier's responsibilities. We've got to witness and certify the commissioning. We've got to certify service entry. We've got to monitor initial performance over a defined period to make sure that that we really are achieving from this ferry what we wanted to achieve, and then we have to manage warranty support if it's a vessel to be purchased, but if it's to be leased, we want to make sure that the supplier is as attentive as he should be to making sure that we get the service that we contracted to receive, and that's it.
Thank you very much. Questions, councillor Love?
Well, thank you for letting me go first. Thank you for your efforts, because what I want to say is that we haven't had the evidence previously. And that's what's important about this report, is that it provides us with a proper analysis to make decisions. It gives us the evidence to base our decisions on moving forward. And whilst we've all talked about what we think is or isn't wrong with it, we've now got a lot of evidence in order to build and move forward. One question, there's a couple of questions I want to ask, but one question. So what I'm hearing overall is that it's not possible really to modify the current floating bridge 6 to do what we want. And if we were to try to modify that, I'm going to ask you to take a guess, which you might not want to, that would be 2 million to modify, or as opposed to a potential 3 to 5 million for a new vessel. Are those sort of, is sort of plus a saving of 600,000 every 3 years against a vessel? So it's how many years has it got lost? 20 years of its life yet? So who's good at maths? I'm sorry, I'm not good at what would that be in terms of cost? That would be 5 or 6 million, would it be? For the hire boat over 20 years. It would be 2 million over that period of time. So we've already got a saving of 2 million by doing that. I'm assuming we've got operational savings because we've got £1 million worth of parts stuck away for this vessel. So I hear, and other bits. So to me, it's illogical not to say we're now going to procure another vessel. It's completely illogical, but because actually we need to think about, we've talked about it in terms of mechanical. I think about it structurally for the island. What does it mean? It makes us investable, which is why the SLEP invested into it in the first place. It's to help our whole island have good jobs, good connectivity between the two, and our tourist markets as well. It's not just about the people that live there, is what I'm saying, is that if you haven't got good connectivity, people won't come from the mainland on Red Jet to get to Cowes, to come across to find a floating bridge that's not working. And there's lots of things that we could do in that design, like separate gangways and things for offloading a separate system. So I think there's a great opportunity here. And hopefully it's going to make money. Because one thing we know about the floating bridge number 5 is it made money, and a lot of money, without having to charge for passengers, for foot passengers. So we know that that worked in that sense. So this is an opportunity for us to create revenue. So what I've heard from this report here today is it's nonsense not to think about not replacing it. We must commission another. We must do it sooner, because it's going to take, and my question is, how long, time-wise? So if you were to push the button now, theoretically, not that we're in that position, to say we're going to procure it now, how long from now, roughly, to delivery might you think that would take? Sorry, that I went right around the houses to get there.
Yeah, that took a hell of a long.
I think that's referred to in the report.
I'm nearly as bad as
Actually,
Claire.
18 months was the shortest option, was it?
Starting at the beginning.
Can I just say, you don't have to answer every part of it, councillor. I'm just conscious of the time. It's 7 o'clock,
No.
and this will come back before our next meeting with a cabinet report attached to it.
I'll be quick, I'll promise.
Yeah.
In terms of what it might cost us to fix it, there are no fixes worth spending money on. One estimate to attach side thrusters to the vessel was £2.5 million we picked up. We didn't even bother to model that because on various bases it would not work.
Might I make a recommendation then?
I mean, we don't need to make formal recommendations at this meeting because we will have the cabinet report attached to it at the next meeting. Yeah, so hold that thought for next time, Carl. Councillor Mosdell.
Mine's a two-part question, and it'll either go to you or to Colin Rowland. There was a capital bid made of 744,000 to replace the ramps. That capital bid was made in January as part of the budget process for last year. Were those ramps replaced? I don't know. It's 744,000.
No, they weren't. Not at
They
that time.
weren't replaced. That's fine.
There were modifications made which made them more effective, and they are operating effectively now, but the actual replacing the ramps, which was a recommendation as another option, was not followed up.
Okay,
Sorry, would you just follow up the reason that was that modifications made were successful? For the Rams?
The modifications were successful because the original design meant that the rams were basically being overstretched every time they went down in certain conditions. So therefore, they were actually under strain often, which then led to them failing, particularly the rams, which made the ramps come down. So when the rams were fixed and the modifications were made to the ramps, then that was felt to be sufficient. So we didn't need to spend the 750,000 on the new ramps.
744 is in my documents. So that brings me to my second part of the question. So if that wasn't spent, it was suggested at that point that 744,000 would come out of the compensation scheme, the compensation fund. So if that money clearly is still there to go towards a new floating bridge, would that be correct?
That's very much a political decision to be made.
Just leave the question there if nobody wants to answer it, but if I'm reading the documentation right, if we didn't do the ramps, then there would still be £744 in the compensation pot towards put another bridge.
Chair, there is a sum of money that we receive from compensation that is banked in this council's bank account. Yes.
Councillor Lever.
Thank you, Chair. I guess it was, unless there are other questions about this report, and thank you for the report, I was sort of landing where Councillor Love was landing, was that in my view, there's no real feasible other option than replacing the bridge with something not quite like Floating Bridge 5 or 6, but something new. And so, and given the amount of preparatory and all the other steps that would need to take next, I just want us to get on with this. So how do we, presuming the next meeting we can make recommendations and then a decision will be made. I just want us to get on with it, and I'd kind of like to see a timeline of steps that we will be taking.
I mean, presumably there would be an element of that in the cabinet paper.
Yeah, what I was going to move on to really, unless there's any more questions on.
Well,
on the
in which
3S.
case, can I quickly bring Councillor Quirk as the only other councillor with his hand up?
Thank you for the presentation. I think your ways forward was very helpful, very complete. The important thing is that we actually follow it. And although there's a tremendous feeling of urgency here, don't skimp at the front and then fail, because I think maybe that's one of the lessons from the past is to what you do. The other thing I would add to your procurement thing is due diligence on the supplier, because one of our suppliers went bust when it was so hard to get compensation from them. There were signs that they were in difficulties at the time that it was awarded. They hadn't returned, done their company returns for a couple of years, which is a big sign of a no-no. So I think you need to put due diligence in there as well.
Can I just answer? That's part and parcel of what we would call the pre-qualification process. As I recall, the designer and the supplier of FP6 were scarcely financially viable. So it would be a question of not just looking at their capability, but their ability to fund their operation, and if necessary, bonds, guarantees from parent companies, all part of a very comprehensive pre-qualification process.
Yeah, okay. Councillor PC Wilcox.
Yeah, I would just, if we're going to look forward, everyone seems to talk about having a bit of the same, and I know no one wants my fridge, but I would like to think some other ideas that didn't actually involve that chain system. That's one of the things we've heard this evening, that the issue is the chains, whether it's an open hovercraft that's got thrust either sides that takes into account the climate change and whatever. It would just be nice to see whatever proposals are that are not restricting us to one, the chains, but also whatever mood the harbour master is in, because you've got that document there. You know, they could also then dictate after the end of a design, because they're separate to this body, that we need to make something so secure that we aren't restricted by that in the future and end up in the same predicament that we are now. Thank you.
Councillor PC Wilcox.
Well, thank you for allowing me to speak as the local long-suffering ward member, along with Councillor Love. We've spent numerous hours here and wasted hours of our lives trying to get to the situation. I know that we've got staff on board, staff that are listening in. And I just want to collectively say from us as an administration, past and present, I thank them for their resilience despite the adversity that they've had to go through with FB6. It's been heartbreaking. As a cabinet, and I hope I'm speaking on behalf of the cabinet, we will work with them to find solutions. And I think Steve alluded to that actually in one of his things, that we must talk to the staff. Having sat here and read numerous reports, including, actually, you'll love this, Councillor Spink, one so redacted that the only words in it were the, at, it and stuff. It was so redacted. I couldn't read any of it. And you know what? The only way I was allowed to read it was with an officer sat watching me on this one laptop that it was loaded down to. And what I would say is categorically, never has the council had such a superb and comprehensive report. It's outstanding, the work that these guys have done. And this could have saved us a lot of time. I introduced the two guys to Dave Stewart. In fact, we went and the county press reported us, went and met on FB5. And it would, if somebody had listened to us years ago, this would have saved a lot of time. I thank all of this committee, because it has been a long meeting, and the public that have sat through there up in the gallery for your interest and your comments. And as again, I speak on behalf of the cabinet, I know that we will take on all of those issues on board, and thank you very much. I could go wax chapter and lyrical, Warren, because you made a good comment, and Sarah did. I would like to talk more, but thank you all very much.
Colin Rowland, did you want to talk about next
Yeah.
steps?
So given what's been said around the room and given the political views of the cabinet, we are being instructed as officers to look at what are the alternatives. We've got the information we've got from John and Steve. They've talked about some of the processes we need to go through. So our next step, which will be in the cabinet report, is the next steps in the process. So what I'd like to do in a minute, I'll pass over to Natasha, but what I would say is Natasha was responsible for the very successful waste contract that we have now, which involved £58 million worth of energy from waste plant, which is successful in terms of our recycling rates and in terms of our processing. And there's a very successful waste collection contract. So what Natasha will do is she's going to talk through part of the process that will form part of the cabinet report. And as we've said before, Chair, we will be bringing that cabinet report to this committee before it actually goes to cabinet for a decision.
Natasha, that's quite a build-up. I think you're going to sort it all.
Thank you. I feel fabulous. Not just a waste collection contract. It's a fully integrated collection contract that goes from waste to grave of everything. But key to that is the reason why Colin has asked me to look at this process, is the process that we went through, which I believe Councillor Quirk has just picked up, has to be very robust at the front end of moving forward with any of these situations. John and Steve have very comprehensively taken us through the correct way to procure large, complex engineering contracts. And to move forward from this point, the paper that we will bring forward, that we will bring at your next meeting as a cabinet paper, will go through the recommendations of how we go to that process to determine that performance output-based specification. That will set out those service level requirements that the market can respond to, rather than somebody dictating lengths or mechanical features, which we are not in the right place to be doing. It will go through the recommendations of how we do that process to determine the current cost base of what currently the operating cost is for 10 years, 15, 20 years, if we continue as is, so that we have a shadow case that sits underneath that we can evaluate options that from the market forward against, so we can see what it would cost us. We can see what that, which is where Councillor Love was going to, looking at those different options of what is going to cost more, what is going to cost less, so that we can determine the best economic outcome. I will look at determining who all the relevant stakeholders are to make sure that those are engaged throughout the process. And then very importantly, also look at that long list and short list option appraisal of everything that is actually available on the market, that the market can bring forward, right back to the work that has been done previously into bridges and tunnels, alternative solutions, and then bring that down through a Green Book, Treasury specified process of long list, short list, to bring that down to a position where we can come back to full council and say the recommendations are these top three options to go into procurement for either in-house, out-house, design, build, operate, design, build, fund authority, design, build, fund privately, and look at all of those different management options so that we can make sure a robust recommendation is coming back to the council to make that very quick and important decision for the long-term Medina crossing solution.
Thank you. I'm going to move on, I think, Carl. Go very quickly, very quickly.
So thank you for that. This is not a detriment in any way, but we've got two excellent guys here who've done a lot of work, who I would be saying we should be supporting them and continuing the work with them in order to make sure that we arrive at this contract. And the reason I say it's not a detriment is because supposedly we went through this process once before the Floating Bridge 6, and look what happened. So we've now got, and I'm not saying that you haven't got the skills. Please don't think that I'm saying that. I'm saying that we've got an expertise here that's in to inform, and we should be relying on that very, very heavily now. Because actually, I don't know about anybody else, but I feel a real amount of trust in what you've done. So it's about progressing that with that, and that's all that I'm saying. And quickly, please, because as far as I'm concerned, the longer we wait, the more money it costs us in losses.
Yeah, Colin.
Just a general principle that Natasha does know what she's doing, but she's got a finite resource. She's also dealing with flood risk. She's also dealing with waste management.
I'm not criticising.
No.
That's in any way. I'm just saying we've got the expertise. Let's use it.
But the point I'm trying to make is that we will need to go out to technical advisors, and we will need to procure those separately to actually help us deliver this.
Natasha.
I'm only going to say, as Colin has done, this process does require external technical advice. We've got procurement advice from these gentlemen, but we also will need engineering advice from the technical sector. We will also need, through that process, legal advice and financial advice to make sure that anything that we eventually move forward with as the way forward is as robust as possible from a legal, technical, financial and procurement position. But there will always be the external advisors that need to be involved.
Thank you. Can I finish this item by saying, on behalf of the committee, thank you very, very much indeed to our consultants. Really comprehensive report. Those comments have been made already, but I just want to endorse that as chairman of the committee. Thank you very, very much indeed. And hopefully this is the start of a new happy chapter. Final item, but please feel free to go. We've just got members' questions, although there may not be any. Do we have any members' questions? Yes, we do. Councillor Spink, feel free to go. Councillor Spink.
I shall be as quick as I can, but I do have two questions relating to the floating bridge of Councillor Jordan. And it's these. When the papers come back to corporate scrutiny, I don't know if, sorry, I wasn't sure if you knew I was talking to you. Oh, good. When the papers come back to corporate scrutiny to decide, or at least to look at the process and perhaps make recommendations, an important factor, it seems to me, will be in deciding a way forward, will be what money there is available for the options. And one of the things that we would need to know, I would have thought, would be what money there is in the pot from the mediation settlement. Now that is subject, we've been told, to a no disclosure agreement. How will that information be conveyed in such a way as to inform corporate scrutiny, but to abide by that non-disclosure agreement? And I've got a couple more.
I refer you to section 151. Officer, the confidential non-disclosure agreement remains in force.
Does that mean then that corporate scrutiny won't be told how much money's in the pot, in the kitty?
Chair, the non-disclosure agreement remains a non-disclosure agreement, and the settlement figure will not be disclosed.
Now, the other two questions I have, one relates to the floating bridge again, and that is this, that the non-disclosure agreement was viewed by the previous chair of corporate scrutiny, Councillor Quigley. Now that this matter is being reviewed by this corporate scrutiny, well, the same corporate scrutiny committee as a body, but under a new chair, will you afford our new chair, or relatively new chair, Councillor Robertson, the same opportunity as you afforded Councillor Quigley to view the non-disclosure agreement?
No.
I would just clarify, because my name's Councillor Spink did not ask me or mention that question to me beforehand. So just to clarify, I put in a request. We both put in a request. That request was turned down.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be minded to renew that request unless an argument was being made that this is affordable, a new plan is affordable because of the settlement. And unless that argument is made, I would not necessarily be looking to make a fresh request. So let's see what the economic justification is in the future. But indeed, I may be chair for 6 weeks more, 2 months more, so it may not be relevant to me.
Can I just make a point? At some point in this council, everybody follows the money. You know, there are lots of us here that've got financial heads and actually can read a set of accounts. So when it comes to a procurement of a no floating bridge, it will end up somewhere with us, like Miss Marple's. We'll find out where that money is and what it is. So it's all very well to saying no and it's not going to happen. But at some point, this bridge will be paid for, and taxpayers aren't stupid, and a lot of us councillors aren't stupid, and we'll follow the money and look at the accounts and see what the amount was.
If I may, I would just give you the advice that part of the non-disclosure agreement allows that money to be reclaimed if that figure is disclosed. I'll just give you that advice, Chair.
I don't want to get in the detail of this now.
I have a third question.
Councillor Spink.
And that is this, it relates to disclosure, but disclosure that you undertook to make, Councillor Jordan, at the last corporate scrutiny committee meeting, which was to disclose an email that you sent, according to your version, that you sent to the statutory officers to cooperate with the all groups in preparing an alternative budget. And you undertook to disclose that at the last meeting to the chair of corporate scrutiny. That hasn't been disclosed. It's pertinent to tomorrow's meeting. Will you ensure that it's disclosed, please, in advance of tomorrow's meeting?
Can't give that undertaking, I'm sorry.
You've undertaken already. Why can't you disclose it in time? How long does it take?
Councillor Spink.
Yes.
I've been away from this council for best part of 10 days, receiving medical treatment. Okay, this is my first day back. Okay, and I'm dealing with a host of things to deal with. I will not give you that undertaking that I can provide that by tomorrow. I said when I gave that undertaking, and the chair was accommodating, that I would provide it to the chair. So don't get too excited, Councillor Spink. And that there was no timeframes on that.
I think I'm going to leave it
Open
there.
and transparent as ever.
I'm going to leave it there. That's the answer. End of the meeting. Thank you very, very much.